Hello everyone, I'm Jed Rubenfeld and this is Straight Down the Middle. Hey, what is going on in the nation's capital? Yesterday, President Trump seized command of the police force of Washington, D.C. And he says he's going to send at least 800 National Guards troops in there as well. Why is he doing that? Well, he says that violent crime is out of control in Washington, D.C. and that it's having a dire impact on the ability of federal employees, federal officials, the federal government itself to conduct operations. Well, this has provoked quite an outcry, and D.C. officials are pushing back and pushing back hard. D.C.'s Attorney General, he said yesterday, there's no crime emergency in Washington, D.C. He says that President Trump's actions are, quote, unprecedented and unlawful. Are they? Are they unlawful? I gotta tell you, I don't think they are. I think that President Trump so far is acting well within his legal authority. Now, that may seem hard to believe after all. It seems kind of outlandish for an American president to seize armed control of an American city. So what is going on? Well, here's what's going on. It has to do with the peculiarities of the way that Washington, D.C. is governed. Because of those peculiarities, the President of the United States has more power over Washington, D.C. than he has over any other city anywhere else in the country. Let me tell you how it works. Okay, so Washington, D.C., being the nation's capital, is not a state, and it is specially provided for in the United States Constitution. The Constitution says that Washington, D.C. is under the direct plenary control of the United States Congress. That's right. Congress, until not that long ago, would pass all the legislation for the District of Columbia just the same way a state legislature would pass legislation for a state. What happened was, 50 years ago, 1973, Congress passed a statute called the D.C. Home Rule Act. The D.C. Home Rule Act, that created a D.C. government with a mayor, and the mayor was in control of the police force, is in control of the police force. But that D.C. Home Rule Act, that has some very serious qualifications on D.C. local self-governance, and one of those qualifications is directly relevant to what's going on today. Section 740 of the D.C. Home Rule Act says that whenever the president determines that special conditions of an emergency nature require the use of the police force for federal purposes, he can seize direct command of the D.C. police force, and the mayor has to give him command of the D.C. police force. Well, that's what the president has done. So is there a problem with that? Yeah, some people say. There's a big problem with that. First of all, where's the emergency? Is there really an emergency? A lot of folks are pointing out, in fact, major media reports quickly seized on data indicating that violent crime is actually down in the District of Columbia. These data show that from 2023 to 2024, there was a significant drop in violent crime. It hasn't been going up. On the contrary, it's been going down. But, this is what the White House says now, those decreased numbers, even if it's true that the crime rate has decreased from 2023 to 2024, those decreased numbers are still very concerning, indeed perhaps arguably even alarming. According to the White House, the rate of homicide in D.C., and I'm talking about in 2024 after the decrease, the rate of homicide was roughly 6 times higher than in New York City and roughly 3 times higher than in Islamabad, Pakistan. So those numbers, even if they are lower than 2023, are still very concerning. And on top of that, the White House says D.C. officials, they're cooking the books a little bit. They're actually underreporting the true prevalence of violent crime in the nation's capital. Now, do I know whether there's a violent crime emergency in Washington, D.C.? No, I don't know. Statistics, you never know whether you can really believe them. But here's what I got to tell you. That whole debate, it's kind of irrelevant. It's not really legally relevant. And let me explain to you exactly why. I got to get a little bit into statutory text here, but it's important. Some federal statutes, when they give emergency power to the president, what they say is the emergency has to exist. In other words, statute says if and when the following emergency exists, then the president has special emergency powers. Now, when a statute is drafted and written in that way, it invites judicial review. Judges say, well, the statute says that the president only has these special powers if the emergency exists, so we've got to look at this and see whether the emergency really exists. But Section 740 of the Home Rule Act Like I said before, it is not worded that way. Instead, what it says is whenever the president determines that special conditions of an emergency nature exist. That's very different. The statute doesn't say that the emergency conditions have to exist before the president gets the power. No, it says whenever the president determines that the special conditions exist, then he has the power. When a statute's drafted and worded that way, that confers maximum discretion on the president. It's essentially leaving it up to him to decide whether the special conditions exist. And so when a statute is worded that way, judicial review, if there is any, is likely to be very highly deferential to the president. Okay, but hang on a second, Professor. There's another problem. The statute's very clear, people say, that the president can only use the police force of Washington, D.C. for federal purposes. And come on, cracking down on violent crime, that's not a federal purpose, that's a local purpose. He's just trying to help the citizens of Washington. That's not a federal purpose. But I'm not sure that argument's too strong either. In fact, I get the argument, but I don't think it's a very strong one either. Let me tell you why. Because the president's executive order, it's very carefully and intelligently worded in this respect. The president is not saying, I'm going to do this solely for the good people of Washington, D.C. What he has said in the executive order is, as I was telling you before, that violent crime in the nation's capital is having a dire impact on the federal government itself. It's having a dire impact on federal officials, federal employees, federal agencies, and preventing the federal government from functioning smoothly and efficiently. Now, protecting the federal government and its ability to function smoothly and efficiently, protecting federal officials, protecting federal agencies, federal employees, well, I got to tell you, that sure sounds like a federal purpose to me. So I think the president's covered on that ground too. Okay, so what that means is, looks to me like the president is permitted to take control of the police force of Washington, D.C., to use that police force to crack down on violent crime, to protect the federal government's functioning. So that brings us to the National Guard. Hey, can the president also bring in the National Guard to crack down on crime? Well, let me tell you, if D.C. were a state, the answer would be very different. It wouldn't be at all clear the president could do that. Normally, throughout the country, the National Guard is under the control of state governors, unless and until the National Guard is called up into the national service. And even when the National Guard is called up into federal service, there's a statute, it's called the Posse Comitatus Act, a federal statute that says even then, you can't use the National Guard for law enforcement purposes. You can't use it as a police force to just crack down on crime to enforce criminal law. Can't do that. But you see, the District of Columbia is very different. District of Columbia is not a state. It does not have a governor. And the Home Rule Act, which I was mentioning before, that does not purport to give to the mayor the power over DC's National Guard. No. Instead, it has always been understood, it's pretty much universally understood, that the National Guard in Washington, D.C. is under the command of the President of the United States. That's right, the President of the United States has direct authority, it's pretty universally understood, over the D.C. National Guard. And on top of that, the restrictions on the use of the National Guard when called up into federal service, prohibiting them from being used as just a police force to crack down on crime, those restrictions, it looks like they don't apply in Washington, D.C. There's a very strong argument that says that when the president exercises his power over the National Guard in Washington, he is allowed to use them, the National Guard, for law enforcement purposes. So, here's the bottom line on that. What nobody disagrees with is this: the President of the United States has more power over the National Guard than he would have with respect to, he has more power over the National Guard in Washington than he would have anywhere else in the country. And you can say that as a general matter, the president has more power over Washington, D.C. than he has over any city in the country. So it's looking to me like the president's exercises of power, the takeover of the police force, and the use of the National Guard are well within his legal authority. But there is a problem, and let me tell you what it is. Here's the real problem the president might face: the duration of his power, the duration of what he's trying to do. Let me explain what I mean by that. Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, that's the provision I've been talking about before. It says that there's a hard 30-day maximum, a hard 30-day stop on the president's exercise of control over the DC police force. Now, that statute, that does not apply to the National Guard. There's no 30-day limit on the president's use of the National Guard, so he's in the clear there. But that 30-day limit would seem to impose a pretty substantial restriction on what the president can do with the DC police force. It looks like what he's trying to do cannot be accomplished in 30 days. What if he wants to extend his power over the DC police force longer? Does he have any options? Yeah, he's got a couple of options. First thing he can do is he can try to get a joint resolution from the House and the Senate authorizing a longer presidential takeover of the DC police force. Section 740 explicitly permits that, permits a joint resolution to authorize that. But here's the problem from the president's point of view. A joint resolution like that might well be subject to a Senate filibuster. That would require 60 votes in the Senate. And probably the president and his Republican allies in the Senate, they probably can't muster 60 votes. So if that's right, then he probably won't be able to get that joint resolution. Is there anything else he could do? Yeah, he's got one other option. Here's what he could do. He could let that 30-day period elapse. He hands the police force back over to the mayor, and then he issues another executive order saying, hey, I determine, once again, that there's still a violent crime emergency in the nation's capital, that violent crime is impeding the functioning of the federal government, and I hereby determine that I need to have control of the police force again to crack down on violent crime to protect the federal government. In theory, he could keep doing that. He could keep re-upping his power over the DC police force by letting the 30-day period elapse and then issuing another executive order doing the same thing for another 30 days. Well, if he were to try that kind of strategy, you can bet that would provoke some serious litigation, and a federal court might well disallow it. The court might say, no. The statute says you got 30 days, and we're not going to let you get around that statute by issuing another executive order on day 32 and re-upping your authority to take over the police force. We're just not going to let you do it. Okay, so we got to just see how that's going to play out. We don't know if the president's going to try to extend his control over the police force for longer than 30 days. We don't know what a court would say about that. But straight down the middle has a verdict for you right now. Right now, for the moment at least, President Trump is within his legal authority by taking over the police force of Washington, D.C., and by deploying National Guardsmen there. Okay, that's all from me for now. I'll see you next time.